Hello and welcome everyone to my video about the Minion Meta changes in 3.21. Now the range of changes we've seen so far is not complete. For example, the changes to the Spiritual Command Node and the Minion Offensive Mastery are missing, and numbers are still subject to change. Without further ado, let's head into it. For the nerfs, I'd like to start with the changes to Molten Shell, which is a powerful guard skill that used to be able to take damage equal to 20% of your armor up to a maximum of 10,000, which can now only take damage equal to 10% of your armor up to a maximum of 5,000, meaning its effect has been halved. Next up is Animate Weapon, which no longer randomly pauses when moving or attacking, at the cost of minus 10% more damage and attack speed at all levels. Whether this turns out to be a buff in terms of effective damage remains to be seen. Which brings me to the changes of Breach. Now overall, the number of Breach splinters obtained from Breach directly and other leak content has been reduced, and the rate at which blessings drop has been reduced as well, which means that Breach uniques, especially the upgraded versions, will be less common and thus more expensive. There are also changes to relevant uniques, such as Severed in Sleep and United in Dream. Now the changes to Severed in Sleep might actually be considered a buff, since we get access to the level 25 Envy, which right now is reserved to United in Dream. We do, however, lose a range of stats such as attributes, minion damage, and the ability for minions to poison enemies. Instead, our minions get a 60% chance to inflict Withered on hit, and our minions get 5% to critical strike multiplier per Withered debuff of an enemy, totaling 75% critical strike multiplier. Now with United in Dream, it's a bit more complicated. Overall, it's definitely a nerf, because it no longer has the minion damage or the life leech against poisoned enemies modifier. There is, however, an issue with the wording of this text. I'm not quite sure whether the new United in Dream is essentially like the old one, minus the increased damage and the leech modifier, but still retains the chance to poison enemies on hit, or whether it's simply the Severed in Sleep plus the minion recover 10% of life on killing a poisoned enemy modifier, which would be pretty horrible. If it turns out to be that the new United in Dream just has this extra modifier, I would actually not recommend people upgrade this, because it's kind of just a waste of currency for the most part. Now, in general, Breach uniques, the upgraded version of Breach uniques, usually are pretty similar to the basic version, with better stats and one or two additional modifiers, which makes it more likely that the United in Dream is actually the latter item, so the one that has all the modifiers Severed in Sleep has, plus the minion recover life on kill modifier. Either way, in terms of damage, they both represent a pretty hefty nerf. So for example, what you can see here is a Chaos Animate Weapon League starter, which right now features the old United in Dream. Going to the new United in Dream in the poison version, which I consider to be less likely, you can see there's around 15% damage missing, which is still better than the version that I consider to be much more likely, which is the Wither version, for which we have to rearrange some minion skills. We obviously have to swap out Withering Touch because we're already getting Wither on the weapon. Now the damage difference between those two variants isn't too big. The version with Wither, which I consider to be the much more likely version, has the advantage of having a much higher chance to inflict Withered on hit than Withering Touch would give our minions, which means that the Withering uptime would be even better, as in we would be able to apply a full stack of Withered within an even shorter amount of time. The reduced damage, in combination with the increased cost for those uniques, represent an overall heavy nerf for poison minion builds. And to make matters worse, there's another thing that probably a lot of people didn't even notice, which is the absence of the minion leech modifier against poisoned enemies. And while it is of course possible to introduce a modifier that allows minions to leech damage, what is so interesting about the modifier that used to exist on United and Dream is the value. And the value on United and Dream used to be 5%, which is so high that with a decent amount of investment, even your utility minions, most importantly your Animate Guardian, can actually leech a decent amount of damage, to the point where high-end minion builds feature Animate Guardians with an additional, let's say, 10,000 life recovery per second. This is now also gone. And while most people probably aren't thinking about this, at least for me, this was always one of the more interesting qualities of United and Dream, because I can get a lot of damage in other minion builds. This pretty much sums up the relevant nerfs to minion builds, which brings me to the pleasant part of the video, the buffs. And I like to start with the newly added Vaal skills, beginning with Vaal Absolution. And Vaal Absolution ascends one of your sentinels, which does not count towards the regular limit. And this ascended sentinel deals more damage and has powerful area of effect spells, which should tremendously improve your clear speed for high-end content such as delirious maps, expedition logbooks, or simulacrums. Next on my list is the Vaal Animate Weapon, which summons extra weapons as unique weapons with a focus on attack-based uniques that have a shorter duration and have a separate weapon limit. Now, the fact that there is no gem for us to look at just yet tells me that they're probably still tweaking the numbers. And if I had to make an educated guess, I would say that the amount of summoned weapons is somewhere between 5 and 10, probably at the lower end of this range. There are other interesting novelties, such as a new helmet that could serve as a meta helmet for the Animate Guardian, which does reduce its life to some degree. The good thing is this is a reduced life modifier, not a less life modifier, meaning it essentially scales like increased life, meaning this is probably still acceptable in terms of life lost on the Animate Guardian, and allows the Guardian to do something very interesting, something unique. It allows it to reserve 8% of nearby enemy monsters' life. And in combination with, let's say, Culling Strike, we only have to deal 82% of the boss's life as damage in order to kill him. Other noteworthy changes include a new generic mana reservation efficiency mastery as a mana mastery, which we can access, for example, via the mana mastery that we can access with Mystic Bulwark, which is a very powerful notable in general. There are also minor changes to power charges. They now provide 50% increased critical strike chance per power charge for players and minions instead of 40%, giving us a total bonus of 30% increased critical strike chance, which isn't a lot, but we obviously don't mind taking 3 damage. In regards to the new league mechanic, the Crucible, we don't know that much. What we do know so far is that we will be able to access Crucible trees that give us or our minions certain buffs, such as flat physical damage, overwhelm physical damage reduction, minion accuracy, minion attack and cast speed, minion damage, and percentage-based attribute scaling. Now, so far, none of this is super crazy, obviously, since this is free damage as well. I'm happy to take it. We're probably going to see more modifiers in the coming days, and obviously during the league. Before that, it's hard to judge, but I'm somewhat optimistic. There's another change to a breach unique that I didn't mention earlier. Specifically, the changes made to the Formless Inferno, which now has 2 interesting modifiers. Specifically, the minion life is increased by overcap fire resistance, which is nice to have but nothing to write home about. And socketed skills are supported by level 30 Infernal Legion. And this is actually really interesting, because taking a look at Infernal Legion, you can see, in case you don't know this support gem, minions supported by Infernal Legion take 40% of their maximum life as fire damage per second, which can be mitigated with fire resistance and of course life recovery. And the interesting part about this breach unique is that when you compare the level 20 Infernal Legion, which is what you usually end up with, when you compare the damage of it to the damage of a level 30 support, you're going to find that the damage is almost 4 times as high. Meaning this, while not being endlessly scalable into the late game, will actually be interesting as a league starter, in which we support a bulky minion that also regens a lot of HP. Could be an Animate Guardian, although I wouldn't recommend that because we only have 1 of them. But instead could be something like, let's say, a Stone Golem, which is a naturally bulky minion and can have its life recovery increased by Primordial Harmonies, for example. And we can also have, let's say, 5 of them without having to bend over backwards. As I mentioned before, this damage isn't super scalable, meaning that it will probably only be viable as a league starter. But as a league starter, it can actually be very interesting because it's a pretty relaxing playstyle. You essentially have some permanent minions which are running around and just burning nearby enemies to death. Of course, the list of viable league starters is still subject to change. It heavily depends on new information that is released by GGG all the way up until the league start, essentially. I will definitely be making a video featuring my top probably 3 league starters or so relatively soon, once we, as I said, have more information available. And while this does not represent the large changes in minion diversity I was hoping for, I'm still interested in seeing what this league actually brings to the table. And this is pretty much it for my first impressions of the Minion Meta changes in 3.21. If you have any questions or suggestions, please feel free to leave them in the comments below. And I guess I see you in the next one.